completely lacking the seed of God, the life of faith, love of Christ and the brethren, sincerity of heart or conscience concerning their duty. Out of these graces, through the work of the Spirit, this assurance may at the proper time be revived. In the meantime, they are kept from utter despair through them. Okay, and so again, the loss of assurance is not the same thing as the loss of salvation. That is important to remember, that objectively, true believers, even when they struggle with assurance, the objective, unchangeable fact of their salvation is entirely untouched. Okay, so lack of assurance does not mean lack of salvation. It just means lack of assurance. And we're going to pick up after 18 on 19, so particularly regarding the statement that the love of Christ and the brethren, sincerity of heart or conscience concerning their duty, out of these graces, through the work of the Spirit, this assurance may at the proper time be revived. Okay, and so again, this continues to be tied to these means. So through these things, it says after footnote 19, so in the meantime they are kept from utter despair through them. Well, what's the them? The them is what follows before that, after 16. Yet they are never completely lacking the seed of God, the life of faith, love of Christ and the brethren, sincerity of heart or conscience concerning their duty. Out of these graces, through the work of the Spirit, this assurance may be at the proper time revived. So these things stay alive. It's maybe like a glowing ember in a wood stove. It's not a fire. It's not maybe visible necessarily. It's weaker than what we would like it to be, and yet those embers or those coals are still alive even if we don't see a visible flame. But the seed of God will not go out. It will not ultimately be removed, no matter how dark the assurance gets. And so we're going to look here now at Psalm 42, 5, and why don't we do 5 through 11? Do we have a volunteer for that? Psalm 42, 5 through 11. Steve, Uncle Steve. Okay, thank you. So we've been in the Psalms a fair bit in this chapter, and there again is obviously turmoil, experiential kind of talk that David himself knew what this turmoil was like, what it felt like for God to be far away, for him to be downcast, for assurance to be snuffed out. And again, I think it's probably beating a repetitive point at this point, but the whole time David was struggling, he was a justified man. There was no point at which David was not justified, even in his dark night of the soul. And I think that is designed to be the comfort here for the believer, is that yes, those seasons happen, but when they do, and they invariably will happen at some level, to all believers are going to have struggles. The Psalms are a great place to go because there a man after God's own heart struggles, and he struggles deeply, and he's honest before God with it. He's not putting on a plastic smile. At least, and maybe this is worth the point of discussion here, is David does not strike me as the kind of person who has a plastic face in public. He doesn't. Okay? And many of us probably know people with a plastic face, okay? Or maybe we think we need to be that ourselves, but that is just simply not the case. So I'm wondering, how do we understand here that we don't need to tell everybody all of our struggles all the time? That gets burdensome and annoying if people are always spleen venting, I always call it, okay? In the old world, your spleen was seen as the heart of your emotions, actually. So that's where that expression comes from. We talk about organs differently. Now we talk about the heart as being the seat of your emotions. To the ancient, your liver and your spleen were the seat of your emotions. So that's why actually direct translations of the Bible talk about your liver. Your liver, and that's meant to refer to your emotions, but be that as it may. So, how do we not just vent and give full vent to all our emotions all the time with people, and yet still be able to be honest about where we're at, that we're not plastic or fake people? How do we do that? Or maybe some people have some examples of how that's been done well or how it's been done poorly. But how do we work with that when we're struggling spiritually? Nope. That's a stumper. The question is, how do we not just vent all the time? It becomes very burdensome if somebody, and I'll give an example. I knew this is nobody even in this province, so don't try to guess, because it's nobody that any of you know, I promise. But when we lived in the States, there was one lady who almost died every week. And they got a miracle every week, but she almost died, and it was extremely traumatic every week. And there was always prayer requests at church, and every week she had almost died. And eventually that kind of gets discounted. At least to me, I tend to discount that, because you can't almost die that often, in my mind. But some people always are venting, or there's always something coming out, which I think we'd agree isn't healthy. But then some people are plastic and pretend like everything is all good when it's not.
It's like when
So,
people ask you, how are you? And not every time you're going to tell them everything.
that's right. Depending on the level of relationship with that person, either you might just say good and keep walking, or it might actually be an opportunity to have a meaningful conversation. Yeah. So when do we know, how do we know when it's appropriate to be honest with other believers, and how do we know when it's time to, stiff up our lip and keep driving on? Lisa and then Ron.
Look inside. If your motives are constantly to attract attention to yourself, to make yourself feel better by dumping all your problems on everybody else, then you might want to start questioning, is this for God's glory, or is this to make myself feel better? Or is this the strengthening of my faith, or is this so I get some attention? Yeah.
Yeah, so Lisa's just saying, I think motive plays a key part. Am I doing this as attention seeking and sympathy, or is this to glorify God and to share something that might be a meaningful conversation, right? Or strengthen your faith, yep. To be encouraged or to give encouragement, yep. Ron? Yeah.
It kind of goes both ways, because that's not encouraging for the other person either. It's that you're just shrug it off with a, yeah, I'm okay. I guess it does have to feel like they can open up, or maybe it's not the right time, but sometimes hard.
Yeah, so Ron's mentioning from the standpoint of the person who's not struggling, from, let's say, a Christian friend, that even the way we ask, if we know somebody's struggling, how are you doing isn't just a throwaway question, right? We're leaving an opening for someone who we know is struggling to be able to open up if they want to, right? And I think that's important too. So what do we make with David's honesty before the Lord in the Psalms? Is that a good strategy, or is that an irreverent strategy? David saying, you're crushing my bones, how long does this have to go on? Is that honest, or is that irreverent? What do we do with that?
I think being honest before God first can prevent spleen venting among people later on, because I think sometimes
Okay, so Jeremy's just suggesting it's a healthy thing to be honest in front of God because it might actually prevent spleen venting, right? So it's not misdirected at other people, it's honest before God. Yep, that's good.
The reality is you can't actually hide your thoughts from God.
Well,
So I know there's times I'm like, well, I don't want to tell God that, but then it's like, oh, well, you already know the thought.
yeah.
Yeah, I think God allows us to be completely honest with Him, and if we feel crushed, we can tell Him.
Yep. Yeah, so Don's just adding, it's not like we can keep our thoughts from God anyway, so whether we are honest in the way we speak it or not, God knows our thoughts, He knows our heart, right? So why not just be honest? James?
Doesn't it also matter trust? You know, David trusted God, so he could tell God anything, but he trusted that God was not going to leave. He told him to me bad things. And that's the same on a person-to-person level as well, right? You can talk to somebody and tell them the truth because you can trust that person, right? And so, and for myself to vent, there has to be a level of trust.
Yeah. Yeah, so James is adding there, God is ultimately trustworthy, so there's no betrayal that will happen by being honest and open with God in our prayers. Yeah, Vern, and then Keith. Yeah. Yep. No, and that's a great point. Vern has just mentioned that who we are before God is who we actually are. When there's no audience to perform for, just us and God, that is the true us, absolutely. Yep, very good. Keith.
Application for such as a brother who needs a rebuke or church discipline, we see a level of lowest amount of pressure possible to increase the pressure with time. I think there's wisdom in that principle that goes beyond just that. I think that method also works well for who do you vent to and who do you go to, but ultimately God is there before every level or along that path. So if something does require help from more people, by all means, don't hold more people. But I think there's a degree of wisdom in keeping it to the people that can actually help you efficaciously. But at the level that way you're prevented from becoming everyone's problem. I don't need the help of an entire town, perhaps, if my car breaks down. I go to the one person who can actually fix the car.
Right, yeah, I think there's wisdom there too. So if you didn't hear Keith, he's just mentioning, just like the principle in Matthew 18, where it's wise in a corrective sense to always use the minimum amount of force. That's, I think, clearly what's being taught there. Only escalate if there's a need to. So Keith is applying that to how we talk to other people. Rather than letting the whole town know, something is wrong. If you're broken down, maybe talk to your mechanic friend rather than venting that to everybody. I think there's wisdom there.
Gossip of yourself.
Yeah.
Application, you wouldn't tell someone else's problems to everyone because that's unnecessary, especially for your own problems. I would tell that to everyone the same way it's unnecessary for them to receive.
Yep. Yeah, no, there is a certain reverence in being a little bit guarded and talking to people that can actually help us rather than advertising. Yeah.
I also think habitual venters are a little low on the gratitude skill.
Yeah.
It's very easy to become navel-gazing and count all your problems, but stop for a minute and go to the blessing side. It can change your perspective.
Yeah. Don just mentioned, again, if you didn't hear it, people who are always venting tend to not be the thankful people in our lives, right? They're focused on the problems rather than what we can be thankful for. Absolutely. I'm going to intensify the problem here a little bit. If we're talking about the Psalms, if we're talking about being honest with God, I read a counseling book a number of years ago where it was talking about honesty with God when we're struggling like this. And it mentioned there that it is okay to be angry with God. And in fact, that is a helpful step to us forgiving God. So what do we do with that? It's okay to be angry with God because that's a helpful step in us being able to forgive God. Is that helpful counseling advice? That's assuming God did something wrong, isn't it? I had to put this book down because I thought that's blasphemous. That's accusing God. That's no longer being honest before God. To be angry at God means he has violated us, which is absolutely impossible. And to forgive God assumes I am in a position of moral superiority over God, because that's what forgiveness ultimately is a morally superior person, at least in a particular situation, being able to forgive the offending party. That is brutal advice. Are we sometimes disappointed or even legitimately angry at the way God has providentially drawn up a story? Yes. But to say that God has done wrong, to me, that is just a spiritual disaster. I had to put that book down, and I had to decide that I am not recommending that particular counselor to any Christian, because I just don't see that as being biblically wise at all.
A couple of chapters in Job that can speak to this matter.
Yeah, Job's friends essentially took that approach. Yeah, and they were foolish.
God's response in Job 40,
Yeah,
God finally had, for lack of a better term, pleads his case.
yeah.
Where were you?
Yeah, God turns that, right? God plays his Uno reverse card and says, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Can you make a doe to give her fawn? Can you make an eagle to fly overhead? Can you do this? Can you do this? Can you do this? And Job, in his suffering, is like God's heavy bag. And then finally he's tired out and he says, forgive me, I spoke presumptuously. And then God goes on for 2 more chapters. Just body blow after body blow after body blow after body blow while this guy is suffering. And then Job finally says, before I heard you with my ear, but now I see you, therefore I despise myself and I repent in dust and ashes. That's how the story ends. Yeah. So accusing God is not biblically wise at all, I don't think. But then I do think, because the psalmist is so honest, I think we need to draw a healthy distinction between being honest with God and being angry at God or accusing God or putting ourselves in a position of moral superiority over God as though he needs our forgiveness. Because, again, let's play that out using biblical picture. What would be an example that you can think of where God directly intervened to keep someone in their evil? Where he intervened or I should phrase it more accurately, where God made a deliberate and biblically explicit choice to leave somebody's evil untouched and leave them in their hardened state. What would be a biblical example of that? Pharaoh. To me, that's the first example that comes to my mind. Pharaoh's heart is hard, and God says, yep, I refuse to intervene. Okay? So God's choice to be passive is actually an active choice, because what does that guarantee? If God says, I'm giving Pharaoh more free reign, the more freedom Pharaoh has, the more evil he becomes, just like all of us. Okay? The more reign God gives us, the worse it gets. Okay? So God does not plant fresh evil in a morally neutral person. He just withdraws his hand of grace from people who are wicked from the womb. So even there, does Pharaoh have a case against God? Does Pharaoh have a legitimate case against God? Can he be angry at God? Can Judas be angry at God? No. Both men did exactly as they pleased to do. Both men did exactly what they wanted to do. So even in those very explicit cases in Scripture, we cannot raise a charge against God. We can't. God gave Pharaoh and Judas more rope to be more Pharaoh-like and more Judas-like. There is no injustice in God. And so again, I want to acknowledge how it feels when we are spiritually and emotionally low. I know that feeling myself. But I want to encourage all of us, do not accuse God in those moments, and certainly do not put yourself in a position of moral superiority over God, where at the end of this, I need to forgive God for his providence in my life. God is incapable of injustice. There are many things God cannot do. Okay? People sometimes think, you know, like the can God make a rock so heavy he can't lift quandary, and that's supposed to get our heads scratching, but there's really that's not a quandary at all. No, God can't make a rock so heavy he can't lift, because God's not logically silly. Okay? He can't. God cannot create another God. God cannot sin. God cannot change his moral law. There's many things God simply cannot do. And that's good. That's not a limitation on God. That's a feature of God. If God could sin, if God could declare good to be evil and evil to be good, that would not be a feature. That would be a bug in God. So there's many things God cannot do. Doing evil is one of those things that God absolutely cannot do. I think I'm good to leave it there unless there's more discussion on this. Then let's move on. So after that note, in the meantime, they are kept from utter despair through them. So again, through these means of grace and through these promises in Scripture that have already been mentioned. So in the meantime, we are kept from utter despair through those things. And then for that, why don't we go to Lamentations 3? Who wants to take that? Lamentations 3, 26 through 31. Who's got that? Harry. Till 31, yep. You got it there? Okay, thank you. Okay, so there it is. So we wait patiently. God will not be silent forever. We will not feel this way forever. God will come at the right moment. Okay, and so the patient approach, the waiting and trusting approach when life feels difficult is the right one. So in the wisdom and in the providence of God, he uses the people in their particular circumstances to write the things that we need to hear, right? And so often when we pray for patience, God does not give us patience. He gives us opportunities to learn patience, right? He doesn't just zap us with the outcome. What does he do? He sends you a frustration, far worse than the ones you've been struggling with patience about. He'll make the frustration worse. That's how he gives you patience. Okay? I talked to one farmer one time who was a dairy farmer who was really struggling very deeply spiritually, and he felt like God was so far away. And he prayed that God would send him some kind of a reminder that he loved him and that he was not cast out forever. And he prayed that during his morning coffee and devotions, and he went to the barn and his best cow was laying dead in her stall. That's often how God answers our prayers. Okay? God, give me patience. Something extremely difficult is about to come. Okay? God, remind me that you love me. You know, there's your best cow laying dead. No more calves from her, no more milk from her. That's actually matches my experience. That is how God works. Okay? God does not often work with unicorns and glitter. Sometimes he does, but that's not his normal way of working. His normal way of working is difficult and challenging, because evidently that's obviously what we need. And that's good for us, because those are actually the things that are going to stretch us and make our muscles stronger and put another 5 pounds on the bar so we're a little bit stronger for next time. And I'm going to stop there and put it back here. Is that just a very limited experience that God answers our prayers, sometimes almost exactly the opposite of the way we'd like them to be answered? Is that unique to me, or is that a widespread experience?
Well, I would think, I suppose, like every hard lesson you go through makes you grow. The good lessons are occasional and there to praise God and to, but it's the hard lessons that make you grow.
Yep. Yeah. It's the hard lessons that push us, right? It's the hard lessons that make us grow. Definitely. Yep. Does that match the rest of our experience? God's answers to prayer are frequently different than what we've asked for. And then we have an occasion to trust that the answer we got is good. That's obviously the one we needed.
Would you say that God does the same thing in sanctification? Where when you ask for sanctification in a certain area, God not tempting you, but allows the devil to expose you to more temptation in that area?
I don't see why not. Yeah. If you want to pray for your swearing problem and then the hammer hits your thumb 30 seconds later, that would seem like an answer to prayer. Yeah. Yeah. I don't see why not. Yeah, and that's frequently how it goes. And I want to also, I think I've shared this a little while ago. Forgive me if I did. But exactly how we, and Christians are not immune from this, how we tend to be nostalgic. And I think this actually directly ties into the challenges that God sets in front of us. Nostalgia is wanting today's capacity with yesterday's problems. Okay? 30 years ago was not better than today. It was not. It just simply wasn't. You had very small capacity 30 years ago, and so your problems were small. Now that you're 60, your capacity is far greater than it was when you were 30, and the problems, you've got problems that match your capacity and usually exceed your capacity, and that's all of life. When you're 4 years old and you're starting kindergarten and you have friend problems, that is just beyond your capacity to handle. Just like when you're 45 and you've got severe financial trouble that are just beyond your capacity to handle, it's the same thing. It was not better 30 years ago. Your capacity was smaller. Now with increased capacity, you look back and see those problems as small, but they were not small then. They were just past your ability to handle them as today's problems are. And I think we need to remember that when we work at being sanctified and when we work at trusting the Lord, is to not get nostalgic, but to remember God always sends a test a little bit bigger than what we're able to handle. Okay, and so I'm going to cut against that proverb. God will never give you more than you can handle. That is false. Okay, everything in life is more than you can handle. He will give you His Spirit to strengthen you in that challenge, so that the strength is through the Spirit working in us, not in our innate ability to handle problems. So all of our problems in that sense are bigger than what we can handle, but they're not bigger than what He can handle. And so we need to keep pushing through those things in trust, and that's how our capacity grows. And as our capacity grows, you can expect that the next set of problems will be bigger objectively than the ones you just went through. But that's okay, because that's how He's been working in our lives all along. And so we shouldn't be discouraged. We should look back at the past with confidence and see God has always brought us through. He's always challenged me just beyond what we could handle, and then He's always delivered in the end. And so why would today or tomorrow be any different? We're always just past our capacity. That's how we grow. That is how we learn. That is just how life works in the wisdom of God. And I'll maybe just stop there. Does that make sense? We grow and we learn when we're just pushed just beyond our capacity. And in fact, if you look at education, that's exactly what education is. Being pushed past what you know right now. That's how you lift weights. You push past what you're able to do yesterday. You have to push through it to get to the next spot. That's life. And that's spiritual life as well. And it hurts. More discussion on that. Does that stretching example, does that make sense? That our spiritual life is no different than any other part of our life in that sense? We always need to put a little bit more weight on the bar? Okay, that's how God does it?
So different than what the culture tells us. Like, completely flipped upside down. Just to think that we actually always push past what we can handle.
Yeah, Audrey's saying, and I agree, this is very opposite of what the world tells you, which is you're great, you got this, you go girl, right? And if it does get too hard, then what's the culture's advice? Well, get that toxicity out of your life. Someone literally made me think about something. Get that toxic person out of your life, right? Somebody frustrated my plans. Well, get that toxic person out of your life. And I'm not saying there's not a biblical case sometimes for removing ourselves from situations, but our culture is very quick to praise ourselves for being so wonderful and so great, and then as soon as something difficult happens, we have to get that toxic person out of our life. And I just don't see biblical wisdom in a lot of that. I think we should expect things to be difficult, and we should expect bumps on the way.
So maybe I'm missing the connection, or I'm thinking of this wrong, but is there a point where there is a good time to remove something from your life, or is that in a way not trusting?
No, I think there is a time to remove ourselves from some people's company, especially if they're pulling us always into a sinful pattern or old patterns. I think there is room for that. What I'm saying is that the conventional wisdom in our age just short circuits all the intermediate steps and goes right there, right? There's people in my own life that I keep at a distance, and that's an intentional choice. And I don't think I'm sinning with that. But the conventional wisdom, the pop psychology today is to just completely, like, people are just dead to me. Like, they don't even exist. And then there's no path even possible for reconciliation. If you have to keep somebody at a distance, that's fine. But you'd always, as Christians, I think we'd always want to leave the door open for reconciliation, right? If somebody is dead to you, well, how can biblical reconciliation ever happen? So distance and boundaries, I think, are important, but get the toxic people out of your life usually is just shorthand for somebody's not affirming me in whatever particular sin I'm prizing in my life right now. Therefore, I have to get that toxicity out of my life, right? And your one wise friend who says, no, I don't think you should go out and wear that in public. Well, she's not affirming you like your other friends, right? Or not that Devin would do this, but if you're going to go with the guys and start complaining about your wife and how tough she makes life for you and stuff, and they're all telling you, oh yeah, right? Well, that's just not, it's not wise. And then your one friend comes aside and says, hey, Devin, smarten up. That's the friend you should actually listen to, right? But that's in the conventional wisdom, that's the friend we push away, is the friend who challenges us sometimes. And so boundaries, yes, especially if there's been serious, deep hurt or people pulling us into sinful behaviors. I would just, as a Christian, I think we need to trust in the Lord too, that maybe this situation can change, and let's leave it open that might happen, rather than killing people emotionally, I think. But that, oh yeah.
I think that's with situations too. I think in the world nowadays they think that situations are wrong and that something happens that should not have happened. And so that's why I need to get rid of it, that it wasn't right. And instead of us thinking, okay, God, this happened. God made this happen for a reason. What is the reason and what can I learn from it and move on that way. And I think that's where the whole God picture is so different, that God works differently than what our human brain thinks should happen. Just like the God is love, and what does that look like? And God should not bring you into difficulties because that's not loving. As this is a different picture of what love is.
Yep.
That you can actually learn from it. And so yes, like Audrey said, it is so different that it doesn't really make sense to our human brain to say, yeah, this is right. And that's with a lot of situations or people too, where it's like, okay, well, that doesn't feel right, so I need to get rid of it. No, just because it doesn't feel right to our brain doesn't mean that it's not right. It's just God's way, it's not our way.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. Yannicka is just mentioning that not just with people, but with situations that are uncomfortable, the conventional wisdom is just to push it away because it doesn't feel right. But what's the biblical promise? All things work together for good to those who love the Lord, who are called according to his purpose. So some blessings are very hard, and we actually dislike the blessing. But Romans 8:28 promises what? It is a blessing. Okay? It's the blessing that's equivalent to getting socks for Christmas instead of Lego. It's what you need, but it's not what I was looking forward to getting, right? But I do believe Romans 8:28 does in fact promise that there's only two events that can happen in the life of a Christian: pleasant blessings and hard blessings. That's the only two things that can happen in the life of a Christian. That's it. But it is a blessing, somehow. Either it's the one we wanted or it's the one we needed. But God is working even in difficult situations that require prudence. But we have testimonies here this morning, so I want to leave time for that. So I'm going to ask Harry and Angelina to please come up and share their testimony.